In the quiet town of Millhaven, justice was not just an abstract ideal, it was the bedrock on which everything stood. It was a town where neighbors greeted one another with warmth, where disputes were settled with handshakes, and where the law was upheld not out of fear, but out of respect. But even Millhaven, with its well-tended gardens and orderly streets, was not immune to darkness. And when that darkness arrived, it tested the town's faith in justice like never before. This is the story of Silas Kane, a name spoken in whispers even now, decades after the events that shook Millhaven to its core. Silas came from nowhere. One spring morning, he stepped off the train, carrying a battered suitcase and wearing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. His arrival was unremarkable at first. Millhaven was accustomed to strangers passing through, and Silas seemed like any other drifter seeking work or respite. But what followed his arrival was anything but ordinary. The signs began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A missing goat from the Miller farm, a broken lock on the church donation box, small, disconnected events that might have been brushed aside in a larger town. But in Millhaven, where everything and everyone was accounted for, these incidents cast long shadows. Whispers began to circulate, uneasy murmurs of something amiss. No one pointed fingers, not at first. But as the days turned to weeks, the unease grew, and all eyes eventually turned towards Silas Kane. Silas was an enigma. He rented a room above the general store, paid his rent promptly, and kept to himself. He was polite when spoken to, but revealed little about himself. When asked where he was from, he would smile faintly and say, "Everywhere." When asked where he was going, his answer was always the same, "Wherever the road takes me." His presence was like the faint smell of smoke in the air, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once detected. And then came the disappearance. It was Thomas Grady, a boy of just 10 years who vanished one bright afternoon. He had been walking home from the schoolhouse, his satchel slung over his shoulder, whistling a tune his mother always sang to him. He never made it home. His books were found scattered along the path, his satchel abandoned near the old oak tree at the edge of town. The search for him was immediate and relentless. The entire town came together, scouring the fields, the woods, and even the river. But Thomas was nowhere to be found. The town's sorrow quickly turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to fear. Silas Kane became the focus of their unease. He had been seen near the schoolhouse that afternoon, lingering by the fence. Some said they had seen him watching the children, his expression unreadable. Others claimed to have seen him walking toward the woods, his suitcase in hand. The whispers grew louder, and the town's patience grew thin. But justice in Millhaven was not swift, it was methodical. Sheriff Harrington would not act on rumor or fear. He demanded evidence, something tangible to prove Silas's guilt. And so, the town waited, watched, and hoped that justice would find its way. Days turned into nights, and Thomas Grady remained missing. The weight of his absence hung over the town like a storm cloud. The people grew restless, their unease boiling into anger. And still, Silas Kane went about his days as though nothing had happened. He walked the streets with that same faint smile, tipping his hat to passers-by who no longer returned the gesture. He sat on the porch of the general store in the evenings, reading a book no one could name, the pages yellowed and worn. He was a man out of place, out of time, and Millhaven was a town on the verge of breaking. Then, on the 5th night after Thomas's disappearance, something happened that no one could explain. The bell above the general store rang at midnight, though the store had been closed for hours. The sound woke the shopkeeper, Mr. Harlan, who hurried downstairs to investigate. He found the door to the store wide open, the lock broken, and Silas Kane standing in the middle of the room. In his hands, he held an object that made Mr. Harlan's blood run cold. Thomas Grady's satchel, its contents still scattered inside. Silas did not run. He did not protest. He simply looked at Mr. Harlan with those same unreadable eyes and said, "It isn't what it seems." but the town would not listen. By morning, Silas Kane was locked in the sheriff's cell, and the satchel had been placed on the judge's desk as evidence. The trial was inevitable, and though Sheriff Harrington urged caution, the people of Millhaven demanded action. They wanted justice, swift and certain. But justice in Millhaven was never swift. It was deliberate, thorough, and unyielding. The trial of Silas Kane began the following week, and the courtroom was packed to the rafters. Witnesses came forward, each recounting what they had seen or heard in the days leading up to Thomas's disappearance. The prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece: the satchel, the broken lock on the general store door, the strange way Silas had lingered near the schoolhouse. But Silas's defense was as steady as a stone. He denied everything, calmly and without hesitation. He claimed the satchel had been planted in his hands, that the whispers against him were nothing more than a mob seeking someone to blame. And still, Thomas Grady remained missing. The trial stretched on for days, each one heavier than the last. The people of Millhaven grew weary, their patience fraying. They wanted an answer, they wanted closure. But justice, as always, moved at its own pace. And on the 7th day of the trial, the truth emerged, not in the courtroom, but in the woods. On the 7th day of the trial, as the courtroom buzzed with speculation and the air outside grew heavy with an impending storm, a sound pierced through the tension. A scream, sharp, desperate, and unmistakably terrified, rang out from the northern woods. It was a sound that stopped hearts and sent chills through every person in Millhaven. Within moments, the courtroom emptied, the townsfolk flooding toward the source of the cry, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the growing darkness. Sheriff Harrington led the way, his jaw tight, his hand resting firmly on the handle of his revolver. Whatever waited in the woods, it would not escape his judgment. The search led them to a clearing deep within the forest, a place that seemed untouched by time. The trees formed an almost perfect circle around a patch of bare earth, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. At the center of the clearing was a wooden crate, weathered and splintered, its lid half pried open. And beside the crate, crumpled on the ground, was a woman, Agnes Harper, pale and trembling, her hands clutching the hem of her dress. She pointed to the crate, her voice too choked with fear to speak. Sheriff Harrington stepped forward, his boots crunching against the brittle grass, and pulled the lid open. Inside was Thomas Grady. The boy was alive, but barely. His face was pale, streaked with dirt, and his wrists were bound with frayed rope. He shivered uncontrollably, his lips moving soundlessly as if repeating a prayer. Sheriff Harrington lifted him from the crate, holding him gently as the boy clung to him, trembling. When he finally found his voice, it was hoarse, cracked, and broken by sobs. "The man in the hat," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "He said no one would come." Those words spread through the crowd like wildfire. The man in the hat. Everyone knew who he meant. Silas Kane had worn the same weathered hat every day since his arrival in Millhaven, a detail so unremarkable at first, but now burned into the minds of every person present. Whispers of anger rippled through the gathered townsfolk, their faces pale and grim in the flickering lantern light. Sheriff Harrington's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Take the boy home," he said, handing Thomas to a waiting woman. "The rest of you, follow me." The storm broke as they marched back to town, lightning splitting the sky and rain drenching the earth. The bell above the courthouse rang out in the gale, its hollow tone echoing across the town square. Silas Kane sat in his cell, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face calm as thunder rumbled through the walls. He did not flinch when the cell door swung open and Sheriff Harrington stepped inside, soaked to the bone and seething with barely restrained fury. Silas raised his eyes slowly, his gaze meeting the sheriff's without a hint of fear. "Thomas Grady is alive," Harrington said, his voice steady but edged with steel. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over Silas like a shroud. "He named you." For a moment there was silence, broken only by the sound of rain dripping through the cracks in the courthouse roof. Then Silas smiled. It was a faint, hollow expression, devoid of warmth. "He shouldn't have been found," Silas said softly, his words hanging in the air like smoke. "But justice, it stumbles sometimes, doesn't it, Sheriff?" The trial resumed the next morning, but the atmosphere had changed. The discovery of Thomas Grady had erased any lingering doubts about Silas Kane's guilt. Witness after witness came forward, recounting the strange, unsettling encounters they'd had with Silas, the way he lingered near the schoolhouse, the way he seemed to know things about people he'd never spoken to. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who was not merely guilty, but deeply, irredeemably dangerous. And yet, through it all, Silas remained silent, his expression inscrutable as the weight of the evidence mounted against him. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned to the courtroom, their verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Silas to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn the following week. The gavel struck the bench, and the room fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Justice had been served, but there was no celebration, no sense of relief. The people of Millhaven felt only the shadow that Silas Kane had left behind, a shadow that seemed darker now that his fate had been sealed. As the days passed, the gallows were constructed in the center of the town square, a stark and somber reminder of the judgment to come. The people of Millhaven went about their lives with a quiet determination, their conversations hushed, their movements careful. No one dared to approach Silas in his cell, save for Sheriff Harrington, who visited him every evening. Each time, the sheriff asked the same question: "Why did you do it?" And each time, Silas gave the same answer: a faint smile and silence. The night before the execution, the storm returned. The wind howled through the streets, rattling shutters and carrying the scent of rain and earth. Inside the courthouse, Silas sat alone in his cell, his hat resting on the cot beside him. He stared at the small barred window as lightning flashed outside, casting his face in stark relief. For the first time, his expression was not one of calm detachment, but of something deeper, something unreadable. When Sheriff Harrington entered the cell, Silas turned to him, his voice low and almost gentle. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll see that justice is not the end. It's only the beginning." The dawn of the execution came quietly, the storm from the night before leaving behind a town wrapped in mist. Millhaven's streets were silent, save for the soft shuffle of boots on cobblestone as the townsfolk made their way to the square. They moved with somber purpose, their faces drawn and pale. The gallows stood tall in the center, its wooden frame stark against the grey morning light. The noose, swaying gently in the breeze, seemed to beckon like an unspoken promise. Sheriff Harrington was the first to arrive, his broad shoulders squared as he stood at the base of the gallows, inspecting every detail with a meticulous eye. This was not a moment to leave anything to chance. Millhaven demanded justice, and Harrington was determined to see it delivered without error. Behind him, the crowd began to gather, men, women, children, their voices hushed and their eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. They were waiting for one man, the man who had brought a shadow to their town and would now face the light of the law. Silas Kane was led from his cell by two deputies, his wrists bound loosely in front of him. He moved with a calm that unnerved those who watched, his steps unhurried, his gaze fixed forward. He did not struggle, did not flinch as the noose came into view. If he felt fear, it did not show. Instead, he wore the faintest trace of a smile that sent shivers through the crowd. As he ascended the steps to the platform, his boots echoed against the wood, each step a hollow reminder of the inevitability of justice. The executioner, a stoic man brought in from the next county, stepped forward to place the noose around Silas's neck. The crowd held its collective breath, the weight of the moment pressing down like a heavy stone. Sheriff Harrington stood at the edge of the platform, his hand resting on his belt, his face unreadable. He looked at Silas, searching for any sign of remorse, any flicker of humanity. But Silas's expression remained unchanged, calm, detached, as though he were watching events unfold from a distance. The judge stepped forward, his voice steady but solemn. "Silas Kane," he began, "you have been found guilty of the kidnapping and attempted murder of Thomas Grady and of bringing fear and unrest to the town of Millhaven. The law has spoken, and it is my duty to see that its will is carried out. Do you have any last words?" The judge's voice echoed across the square, carried by the still morning air. For the first time, Silas spoke, not in the low, measured tones he had used during the trial, but in a voice that rang out sharp and clear. "You think you've won," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You think justice is a noose and a drop. But justice doesn't end here. It follows you, it remembers you, and it will find you, even when you think you've escaped." His words lingered in the air, chilling those who heard them. But no one responded. The judge nodded to the executioner, and the lever was pulled. The platform fell away, and Silas Kane dropped. The crowd gasped, some turning away, others staring in morbid fascination. The sound of the rope tightening was sharp and final. For a moment, all was still. Justice, it seemed, had been delivered. But justice, as Silas had warned, was not the end. In the days following the execution, the town of Millhaven tried to return to normalcy. The gallows were dismantled, the rope burned, and the platform taken apart board by board. The children returned to their schoolhouse, the farmers to their fields, and the shopkeepers to their counters. Yet something lingered in the air, an unease that no one could name. People spoke in whispers, casting furtive glances over their shoulders as though expecting to see Silas Kane's shadow following them home. Then the dreams began. It started with Sheriff Harrington. On the first night after the execution, he woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the sound of Silas's final words ringing in his ears. "It will find you." In his dream, he had seen the woods where Thomas Grady had been found, but they were different, darker, denser, the trees pressing in like prison bars. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood Silas Kane. His hat was tilted low over his face, but his smile was unmistakable. "It's not over," Silas had said, his voice calm and steady. "Justice never sleeps." The dream spread quickly. Farmers woke to visions of shadowy figures moving through their fields. The schoolteacher, Miss Alden, dreamed of Silas standing outside her window, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Even the judge, a man of unwavering logic and reason, began to see Silas in his sleep, always standing, always watching. By the end of the week, the entire town was gripped by a shared fear, an unspoken understanding that Silas Kane's story was far from finished.
Do you think Silas Kane was the terror to the town? If it wasn't Silas who then was behind the happenings? Share your thoughts in the comment section and watch out for part 2.